Welcome to an hour of Healthmate Radio. Healthmate is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. Healthmate Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmate.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Dr. Christopher Kerr. Dr. Christopher Kerr is the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Hospice and Palliative Care in Buffalo, New York. Born and raised in Toronto, Canada, Chris earned his MD as well as a PhD in neurobiology. Outside of direct patient care, Chris's focus is in the area of patient advocacy. His passion is palliative care and the belief that such care should be throughout the continuum of illness. Under Dr. Kerr's medical leadership, Hospice Buffalo now serves 1,200 patients a day, half of whom receive services prior to hospice. Dr. Kerr's background in research has evolved from bench science towards the human experience of illness as witnessed from the bedside, specifically patients' dreams and visions at the end of life. Although medically ignored, these near-universal experiences often provide comfort and meaning as well as insight into the life led and the death anticipated. To date, the research team at Hospice Buffalo has published multiple studies on this topic and documented over 1,500 end-of-life events, many of which are videotaped. This work was the subject of his TEDx Buffalo talk, which has been viewed approximately 3 million times. It has been the subject of reports on the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, Scientific American Mind, Huffington Post, and Psychology Today. It will also be featured in an upcoming Netflix production and a public television documentary film to be released nationally in early 2021. Dr. Kerr's work was also published in a book earlier this year, Death is But a Dream, by Penguin Random House, and is now being released in multiple languages. Dr. Kerr, it's such an honor and pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, the privilege is mine. Thanks for having me.
This is such an important topic, and this is an area that people are trying to find understanding as to what this part of life, the ending component of life, what that really means, and how to kind of be in that moment. So I'm curious, why did you write this book? I mean, what drove you to writing this book?
The whole journey's been unplanned. The motivation was frustration, actually. I started doing this work at Hospice in 99, just moonlighting, and I ended up making it my career. And I was really not trained to treat dying patients in totality. And my colleagues in other disciplines were really showing me that patients were having these other experiences, or there was this inner experience of dying, the patient's perspective on death. And I was trying to teach that. And, the rebuttal I always received, because we live in an evidence-based era, is there's no evidence for this. So despite it being written about throughout time and cultures, there was nothing by our medical standards for evidence. So I started to do the research for that reason. And actually it didn't work. I published extensively and received very little feedback from the medical community. And then what happened was interesting. It snuck out into the non-medical community and it went around the world. And so there's a story in that. There's a disconnect between the people who are providing the care and the people who are receiving the care and their loved ones, and these sort of things actually matter. And what really drove the book was just the overwhelming response from caregivers and patients who had this finally explained in a caregiver framework or validated, because it hadn't been. It's not explained clinically, typically. at least not from physicians. So that's kind of what drove this.
So I'm curious. Obviously, you came into this as a medical doctor, and I mean, how can you measure these kind of events? So if you're looking at trying to prove something scientifically, you always want to have something that you can measure, that you can see. This is control group and this is the non-control group. How are you able to kind of bring this type of information into a scientific medical thinking world?
Well, we did a couple of things that were important. Right off the bat, our inclusion criteria for participation meant that you had to be excluded from a confusional state. So there's screens for delirium or confusion. We looked labs and med lists and that sort of things to make sure people, and these are IRB approved or university approved studies, so it's like signing a mortgage basically. You have to be cognizant and aware of the repercussions, etc. So we dealt with that right up front because a lot of people dismiss this as a confusional state. And then we used validated questionnaires and we would ask people every day until death. And we did the right statistics, so we had the right power, etc. And then we also include a qualitative measure, which asked people, what was their interpretation of this, etc. And then finally, we filmed a lot of people because what we found was it wasn't believable to people for us just to explain it. They actually had to see it. And that's really important. And the irony, of course, is, almost a decade later, that's part and parcel of what's in the full-length documentary and the Netflix piece, is this early footage, which was really meant to make the case to the medical community.
And so I know this, I'm going kind of your personal experiences. I know you were talking in your book about at age 12, your father passing away, and you being by the bedside. I mean, do you feel that is something that somehow the universe kind of guided you towards this type of work? Because did that have an impact? Did you feel?
Well, it's such a great question, which I never get, but you have to wonder that I was very comfortable living on the death-defying side of medicine. And really liked acute medicine, interventional medicine, and then how did I end up here? And of course, this, the most traumatic event of my life, which was the loss of my father as a child. I witnessed this and really didn't speak about it, and then I ended up studying it. And actually, I think a lot of my life I was avoiding it, and then I ended up here, and of course, I'm witnessing what I was trying to avoid. Yeah. And so it's a great question. You got it makes you wonder. I think it's certainly, obviously it had an emotional tone and texture for me that might not have for other people, and left me with this burning question. But intuitively, I also knew what I witnessed my father going through was inherently comforting and therapeutic, and that never left me. And that's how I think that's influenced, I hope, who I am at the bedside, because they are overwhelmingly meaningful and comforting for people. So. And with all your experience and all your, what you've witnessed, from the 1,500 dying processes that you've been able to study and research. Do you feel, with all the information that you have now, if you would go back to the time when you were 12, how do you feel that how could that event go differently, do you feel? How would you like to see it? Obviously you can't change it, but it's kind of reflecting back to that moment. Well, another great question. I think that what happened to me speaks to one of the problems is how we treat sick people in general, particularly at the end of life, which is we sterilize them in a sense. And we inadvertently dehumanize what is actually a very human process. And there's good in there. And so I think what I would have hoped to have experienced is being brought closer to the bedside, not farther from the bedside. And because what I knew at the time was that wherever he was good. He was okay. And that's what we worry about as loved ones is, where are they? Are they okay inside? And I think actually some of the most moving videos we have are from families who, and we've actually done studies on this where we've asked bereaved people, and we've measured their grief processing and all those things. So we have evidence actually that it's extremely valuable for those at the bedside who are witnessing this. So yeah, that's what I would hope.
Yeah, and I know that you, like you were saying, that we were viewing kind of medically, we were looking at kind of a sterile process where you can't really do any more medical intervention because the person is dying. But in your mind, that is really when you need to be engaged. And what does that engagement look like? I mean, for people out there, what should they learn from what you've seen? I mean, how to be engaged and how to be part of this process.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. I think when you're with somebody on their path in illness, we understandably are very organ-focused, right? Where's the tumor? How big is it? All of those things. And yet when they're on a more terminal path, dying isn't about organ failure. The patient doesn't feel the renal disease necessarily, or the failing heart. What they experience is a different vantage point that is really less about organs or parts and more about life closure. And I think that comes down to fundamental relationships. So their loved ones actually are very integral to that process of reconnecting. And dying is isolating and disconnecting. And so that people who love somebody who's in that state need to get closer in connection, not farther. And that helps them put themselves back together again in terms of, so less defined as a patient with failing parts, but more as a person who is invested in with a life that has love and relationships and all of those dynamics. So I think that's key. And then, recognizing that the dying person is having these inward experiences and reflection upon the life that they had. And there's a lot to say from that view.
Well, yeah,
and it just needs to be respected, I think. And we don't have to necessarily understand it all, but we certainly need to have reverence for it.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. He's the author of Death is But a Dream. Dr. Kerr, you were talking about the dying process as being a time where it's a kind of a disconnecting process, but like you're saying, it's also a time of healing where you almost need to connect more, and it's almost like the connections and of the dying person shifts through that experience. And what are your thoughts about that? I mean, it's in your book. It seems like, it will say, what should I say? It was kind of a pattern of experiences that individuals had as they were dying, and with that, they kind of rekindled relationships that they've had in the past. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of key features, and so dying naturally involves deeper sleep. That's essentially what dying is progressive sleep. And so they kind of wax and wane, sleep architectures change, levels of alertness change. And then secondary or superimposed to that, you are automatically, as your life ends, put in this, seeing life in a different perspective, and the things that matter most seem to come to surface. And time seems to be irrelevant. We see this again and again and again. That a man who may be 95 lost his mother when he was 5, and it's her voice he hears, her perfume that he smells. So it becomes very experiential. It's almost like everything becomes heightened in terms of what we're feeling and experiencing. When we track patients who do this, so the vast majority, close to 90%, are experiencing some kind of experience like this. We use the term dream, even though when we measure realism on a 0 to 10 scale, they say they're very realistic, like it's lived, it's virtual, it's tangential to them. It's absorbed. The majority of them, about 85%, are extremely comforting. The interesting thing is there's a change temporally. So as people get closer to death, going from months to weeks to days, there's an increase in frequency in these intensity of these experiences, and also you're more likely on content to see people who you've loved and lost. And interestingly, when we measure levels of comfort, seeing the deceased is associated with this highest level of comfort. So there's this natural mechanism that seems to occur as you're going towards death, where you're reunited, in a sense, with people who you've loved, who are no longer here. And that brings you the greatest degree of comfort. We've looked at this notion of post-traumatic growth, this idea that within a negative experience there's meaningfulness. And people who are having these experiences actually score higher on scales of post-traumatic growth. In other words, they don't stop living because they're dying. And in the dying process, they become rich again and adapt and grow and gain insight. And on the inverse, then, their fear of dying diminishes substantially. So this is a profoundly meaningful set of experiences that people go through.
And I know you in the book you had a number of examples exactly of that. You had a detective that didn't view himself very well, and then you also people that been at war and gone through some pretty traumatic experiences and had a lot of healing that needed to take place. So how does that process go through for an individual like that? I mean, what does that look like?
Well, I think that's it's interesting. We were so naive when we started doing this work, is we asked patients to measure whether there was comforting, discomforting, or neither, and we found out that about 15-17% of people were having negative, the themes they were dreaming about were negative. Well, what turns out, though, is it was that's overly simplistic. The negative experiences actually often contained the most powerful transformation. And an example is a gentleman who had PTSD for 67 years from the invasion of Normandy. And at the end of it, he came in, he was tormented with flashbacks and imagery. He actually was pulling people who were wounded or dead from shore going back to the ship, and that's all he was revisiting. And then very close to death, he's confronted on a beach by soldiers who tell them, it's okay, and we're coming for you. He had enormous survivor's guilt. And after that, he felt relief and he was able to sleep. And so it's fascinating to me that he lived all those years and there was no talk therapy or medicine that brought him relief. It had to occur from within, and it did. So it's just remarkable how those. We had another gentleman who lost his arm as a child, and he grew up in a blue-collar household. His whole world was, how was he going to live? How was he going to be able to support himself? So he took great pride in his work. That was a lot around his identity. And as he's dying, his coworkers and his mind were coming to him and telling him how he was better than everybody else at his job. So this idea of forgiving, or that we all have wounds for having lived, and that they're often addressed. Again, it's this idea that what these critical moments in life, or these injuries, or these relationships, seem to edit themselves and come to the top as we're nearing the end.
So it almost seems like you have this kind of compressed time where you are then able then to evaluate your whole life and clear out some of these the things that have been plaguing you, or that the traumas that you shouldn't bring to the next phase in your existence, whatever that may look like. And you're given that opportunity right during that dying process.
Yeah, and what's really struck us is we've yet to have a patient come out of one of these experiences and go, hey, what do you think this metaphor means? Or ask next questions off these experiences. They don't come with questions from this. They come out of these experiences with answers. Something was felt, intuited, understood, but it doesn't lend itself to analysis or therapy or intervention. And time and again, one of the other common things is that very little is said between the person in the dream and the dreamer. And it's always interested us, but they're given an understanding. The other thing that's really interesting is they edit their life. So it's not uncommon for somebody to dream of one parent but not the other, two siblings but not the other one, and it tends to be the people who love us right, who secure us, who are unconditional in their giving of love. Those are the people that secure us and come back to us. And the people who withheld or conditioned or harmed us aren't there. So in the case of the boy with two arms, he had two siblings who teased him, and four that didn't, and he sees the four that didn't. We've actually had people who had three husbands, and they love the second one, and that's the one who comes back. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And let's take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr, and he wrote a book, Death is But a Dream, and it's based upon 1,500 end-of-life events. I mean, it's a fascinating book. I read it yesterday, and it was a really touching book. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. He is the author of Death is But a Dream, and also he has an upcoming production, a Netflix production, so be sure to kind of tune into that. It's going to be released in the early part of next year. So in regards to then this process where you have someone that's going through all this healing and clearing out traumas, how should we as an individual, as a family member, be able to integrate with that and be part of that, without interrupting that process?
I'm sorry? How do we make ourselves a part of this?
So we have family members that are then viewing this healing process taking place, and they're there visiting their loved one going through this healing process, and they may not really understand what this individual is going through, and maybe communicating about dreams and visions that they don't understand. So how should an individual that's not able to really fully connect with everything that is going on, that love this individual, watching them, through their end-of-life process, how should they behave and how should they view this experience so that they don't interfere with this healing process that's taking place?
Well, I think there's some general guidelines. One is that you don't you don't invalidate the process or try to recontextualize somebody who's, let's say, referring to things that you're not experiencing. It's vitally important that the person is supported in whatever their experience is, and it goes back again to this idea of reverence. And we had this. This occurs even with dementia, and unfortunately, we often redirect people who have cognitive differences. We had a lady recently who, as she's dying, she's trying to leave because she's re-experiencing her wedding day, the best day of her life, while she's dying. And I just think that needs to be respected. So I think it's off. It can throw people off kilter a bit to see a parent referring to things and events from childhood. I think knowing that this is common is helpful, and giving it permission to occur. And it doesn't mean that there's tumor in their brain or that they're drugged or whatever. It's just part of the experience. We see it on people who with no medications who are fully intact cognitively. So just having that kind of reverence for it, that this exists, it's part of the human experience, and bring yourself closer to it. I had somebody recently, and I walked in the room, the daughter's sitting in the corner because her mom's speaking in her native Polish language, and she's referring to things from childhood, and the daughter was very put off by this, and when it is explained to her that, no, this is a good thing. She's reconnecting herself. The next day I go in, and she's at the bedside, and she's making notes because her mom is referring to things of her childhood, her grandparents, her pets, her friends, and she was actually learning a lot about her mother she didn't otherwise know. So it's a thing, it's a sort of thing that family members can actually be a part of, because there tends to be these themes of connectivity between lives. So, it's daughter to mother to her grandparents. So it's not something to fear. And again, the idea of accepting it for what it is, and that it's normal, and giving it permission to and space to occur.
And how, so you have then with the loved ones that are just understanding the process, but then as a medical doctor, the medical community, how do you feel it should be different? I mean, obviously what you are doing at your at the Center for Hospice, there in Buffalo, New York, it's very unique. How do you feel it should be viewed upon more medically, and it should? I mean, should the medical model change around this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's actually going in the wrong direction. Quite honestly, Care's more fragmented. Primaries, let's say, don't go into hospitals necessarily. They don't know the people. To do this kind of work, you have to take care of people in totality and recognize that there's their pains and their solutions are sometimes spiritual, existential, practical, sociologic. A dying young mother's worried about her children. So I think, yes, ideally, theoretically, medicine needs to be whole person centered. I don't feel it is. I think it's one of the beautiful things of having other people participate. Volunteers, chaplains, nurses, social workers. Nurses understand this stuff intuitively. The people who actually work at the bedside. In our first study, a lot of the referrals came from aides, people who were bathing and feeding and touching, who knew these patients as people. So I think a lot of the answers come from other areas, and this isn't necessarily the domain for medical doctors only kind of thing. And again, it goes back to this idea of dying is much more expansive than our medical model allows for. And if you're going in, excuse the term, but as a spot welder, you get a consult and you're a nephrologist or a pulmonologist or a cardiologist, I'm not sure how much space there is for you to address these other concerns. And the reality is the medical economics of it all are squeezing the time that we're allowed to actually get to know people. There isn't a lot of time to truly sit and have room to do this sort of thing.
And that is what I think is so beautiful with what you're doing as an MD, to be there and take that time, because obviously this is a process that it's not fast. And so there's a lot of connection that is needed to take place, but then you can then see the healing and the value of the time that is spent with this individual, and really get to know them and be part of this process.
Yeah, it's the beauty of the hospice model. The framers knew what they were doing, and were protected to actually, and expected to sit down, be present, listen to our colleagues in other disciplines. So we have mandatory interdisciplinary teams every week on every patient. That forces you to get out of a contemporary model of medical practice, and it's healthy.
Yeah.
And a hell of a lot more rewarding, actually.
Yes, I mean, reading your book. I mean, I want to be there and get to.
Yeah, it really is. It's a wonderful. It's funny because people assume that this must be depressing, or we must be depressed, and the reality is there's more life-affirming work here. To see what caregivers do, the courage and strength, the love they find to provide care is remarkable. So we see more good.
And it also getting to experience that time where kind of the sharp line between life and death is getting blurry, and you get to walk a little bit in both worlds and get to kind of feel what that is like and what an individual is experiencing while they're in that space.
Yes, and you end up walking away feeling very privileged. Because what matters again comes to the forefront. So the grandchild and grandfather, what have you, that to see all of that is really a privilege.
Yeah. I'm going to take a quick break. You're listening to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. He's the author of the book Death is But a Dream. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthmate Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Kerr. I'm curious, Dr. Kerr. So people, obviously, you have people dying from all ages. You have elderly, and I assume that is a certain pattern, or it seems like it's a certain pattern where you're saying that you have 85% of them roughly that have very life-affirming and healing, and then you have about 15% that goes through a little bit more kind of a traumatic experience, but still at the end of the day, it is very kind of healing, from healing those traumas. Is there a difference between ages of individuals, meaning that somebody that hasn't lived a very long life, if you're very young, versus somebody that has been on Earth for 80, 90 years, or somebody dying kind of midlife? I mean, are the experiences different?
Oh, completely. Yeah. It's a very different path for people who. It really often comes down outside of childhood. It comes down to our sense of the sense that others are dependent on us. So if you're midlife and have young children, that's completely different than if you're in your ninth decade and everyone you love and are responsible for is on their own. So that's one level. The other, of course, is children, and children do this very, very differently. And there's a chapter in the book about that, and we have a lot of film actually on this. They tend not to have language for mortality, and they may not have even known anyone who has died. Yet their imaginative world and ability to create, essentially, when their eyes are closed, is I think there's an even greater capacity. Several of the children in the book, for example, hadn't known people, but they knew animals that had passed. And the message is the same. They come back healthy and vibrant. And the children, in their own words, tell us that, it means that I'm loved and I'm not alone. So it's fascinating in those stories because the questions of talking to the children about the end of their life was obviously rough terrain, and yet they seem to be able to self-inform in their own way through these processes, and again, enormously positive and reassuring. The one young lady was raised by a single mom, and so her her next questions were, who am I, what am I without my mother? And then she has dreams of her mother's deceased friend who she didn't know, in her mother's room, wearing a particular outfit, playing with the blinds. Again, not alone, secured, okay. So it turns out that the path there may be different, and maybe through the side door, but they get there in the same way.
That's fascinating, and just kind of reiterate. So through for all these 1,500 end-of-life experiences that you documented, fear through this process or toward the end of the process, is that how common is that? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying that it's not common at all, but
no.
I mean, it's not common. Have you seen it at any time out of all these 1,500?
No, I can't really. I mean, there's certainly regret. I think what people misunderstand is when we project our own mortality, we're coming from a vantage point of health, and it's horrifying to our core to think that we're at the end of our life. People who are sick have a whole different path, kind of, in that they adapt in it, and it takes a lot of work to be sick, and a lot of people are tired from being sick, so they're not looking at it from health; they're looking at it from debility, frailty, and it feels better to have their eyes closed and asleep than it does to be awake. So it's experienced entirely different, and fear does not seem to be one of the things that's predominant. What is actually the fear that's there is interesting, and it's the fear of not knowing what's going to happen. So if you took a bunch of people and said, okay, well, you've got a terminal disease, and you asked them what they anticipated, they would anticipate overwhelming physical pain and suffering. And the truth is, death is generally peaceful, natural. There's medications if needed. It looks after itself. It's not what people think it is. But we don't tell people that. And they often feel illness may have been suffering. And they feel that, if you extrapolate from my experience of illness, it's only going to get worse as I head towards death. But what happens is, you lose appetite, you eat less, you're weakened, you sleep more. It's quieter. It's more acclimatic than people think. So fear, coupled to that, goes away. But the fear really is because we don't do enough to alleviate fear of the unknown by having honest, rich conversations.
So you feel that is, I would assume that would be something that should be part of not only with the individual that's dying, but also with the family members, so that they really, like you mentioned, that they really understand the process.
Well, I've seen hundreds of family members who actually have found it very hard to close their eyes and rest because they're frightened that they're going to miss their loved one in some kind of excruciating state. We're actually looking at this, the disconnect between what's expected and versus what's experienced. I mean, we hardly tell people honest information prognostically, let alone tell people what to expect. I told somebody this recently, that I see patients who actually come from our cancer center, which is a national cancer center, and they'll know the price of coffee. They'll know what the parking is and what the best times to go on what level are. But they actually don't know anything about how their loved one is going to pass. Yeah. So they don't know what the practical needs are. They don't know and it's the void of information tends to be filled with notions that are worse than they are. They fear the worst. Choking, vomiting blood, what have you, uncontrolled seizures. What people don't understand is the body's lessening. So if, let's say, you have cancer in the leg, you're not walking anymore. So it's quieter.
Yeah, so all these kind of symptoms, so as the body gets weaker, it has less energy to create these seizures or create these pain signals and create all of that. Everything, the body just kind of sinks in and
yes.
Like you said, it becomes more silent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't symptom issues in the disease process. I'm talking about towards the end. It's quieter. You're dying typically because you're not eating, and your body's telling you not to eat anymore. You just don't have appetite, and it's telling you to sleep more.
Yeah, and what was interesting in the beginning of your book, you're talking about you had the interaction. You're a new doctor at this hospice, and you had interaction with a nurse, that was very experienced. That was an HIV patient, and she mentioned that he's dying, and you thought, well, there's more we can do, but it's then you later came on to that realization that the frequency of them communicating with dead people or people that left before them is almost like an indicator as to how close they are to their passing.
Yeah, the nurse was Nancy, and they actually tracked her down and interviewed her for the documentary. And she was one of the reasons we set the study up the way it is, because the nurses all felt they could prognosticate on the frequency and intensity of the experience of whether they were seeing their deceased people. Tragically, all I knew as a doctor was to do things to people. So I thought I needed to do things. So IVs, antibiotics. And she says, no, he's seen his deceased mother. It was crazy. So when Nancy's theory was right, when we did our study, we saw an increase in frequency of these experiences as people got towards the end, and they saw predominantly the dead. So I just think it's wonderful that the bedside observations bore out when we put some scrutiny to it. But obviously that's something you don't learn in medical school.
No, like you mentioned, you must have missed that class.
Yeah. Well, actually, just an interesting anecdote. When I used to do a lot of intensive ICU time, we would actually sign patients off of our teaching service. We would essentially discard or abandon them when they were on a terminal path because there was nothing more we were going to do to them. So we felt there was nothing more to drive us or benefit us in our education. So it was essentially institutional, educationalized, endorsed patient abandonment.
Yeah, when they need you the most, like you're saying, that at that
exactly.
time you need people around you more than any time.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's actually one of the things we're looking at, this notion of medical harm, people who are getting $1 million care when they're deemed treatable, and when they're no longer considered treatable, they fall off of our system.
Yeah.
There's actually no billing mechanism to be cared for because you just don't feel good anymore, But if you're going to get imaged, come right in. So
yeah.
It's a weird system.
Yeah, it truly is. I'm curious. I know that in your book you mentioned that this is, you're watching kind of pre-death, the end of life process. But with everything that you have experienced and what you've seen, what is your view on death? I mean, what is that?
You mean as in what are the implications of this in a broader sense?
Yeah, or what is? I mean, what is? I mean, yeah.
If I had to wrap it all up, I think there's a better story. I think that it's, and I just, by way of disclosure, I wish I could tell you I was innately this powerfully spiritual person, but actually, I don't think I was. But I think that the lesson's pretty clear that, certainly dying is more than what we see, and there's a better story in that people are really defined in terms of their relationships, their loving relationships, and that where harmed, those things are also tend to be addressed in a positive way. And we were very intentional not to editorialize this in terms of a larger meaning. What does this mean, afterlife or paranormal? But it certainly is more reassuring that where we thought maybe there was finality, there isn't. I'm fascinated with this idea that people are surrounded and cherished by their best memories, and that seems just and comforting.
Yeah, it looks like from all the reading that I did, and what you're mentioning, that this is obviously we have, just by understanding this side of the fishbowl, so to say, we don't know what the world looks like outside, but there seems to be a transition from one reality to another, and right at that kind of end of life moment is where you're getting to experience both worlds, like we mentioned.
Actually, that's a very good way to put it. It's a better way to put it, which is they're experiencing two realities. And that's actually a really interesting subplot here, was this idea, we can all identify with this idea of fighting the dying of the light. But we've got fascinating videos where actually people are drawn to what they're experiencing and want to go back to what they were experiencing. They're not fighting against anything. They're fighting towards what they were feeling. It's the absolute inversion of what we anticipate in our health.
Yeah, like you're saying, we're so used to surviving. Do everything possible to save life, to live, to heal, and we have to shift that paradigm and move towards another type of healing, which is then kind of letting go of this existence and moving on to whatever the next phase is.
Yeah, and I actually think that's what it boils down to, right? Is if we weren't innately resistant at all at every cost to fend ourselves off against the mortality, we wouldn't have survived. But when that passes and the inevitable is there is a switch. Yeah, exactly. Well, Dr. Kerr, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show, and this is such a powerful book. Death is but a dream, and it's a book that I think, we all experience as loss in life. It's inevitable, and I think to have a tool like this with you while you go through that, I think I can't. It should be part of a MasterCard commercial. Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
great questions.
Well, thank you so much. Well, that is it for today. You're listening to Healthmate Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmate.co. Health is what you make it. Health is what you make it. Health is what you